Introducing myself, my name is Jeff Wiseman, and I see that Daryl Copeland has arrived. Daryl, so good to see you again, and Mark and Lydia as well. So let me just start off with a very brief comment, and that is to the effect that I think I, at least, and here I'm speaking very personally, along with perhaps quite a few members of the conference today, are quite incredulous about the beating that science has taken in recent years. And to me, it's quite extraordinary that that science now needs to actually defend itself, and that evidence-based claims are dismissed by purveyors of disinformation, and now not only in authoritarian system, but alas, also in leading democracies. So climate change denialism, anti-vaxxer falsehoods during the COVID-19 pandemic have all reinforced these general instinctive trends that I've mentioned. And this is an area that I am not expert in, but to help us engage these sorts of claims that I've opened with and to assess these trends, this panel is entitled Science Diplomacy, Environmental Knowledge, and Global Public Health. Now, following the presentations of our three speakers, I'll take questions from the Q&A portal, which you'll see at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And please submit your questions as you go. You can direct them at one of the panelists or at two or at all three. And then we can basically have a Q&A after our presentations, which will be roughly 15 minutes each. So let's turn now to our speakers. And the very first one is Daryl Copeland. Daryl is a former Canadian diplomat. He's also an educator, an analyst, a consultant, but I would say iconoclast. Daryl is a research fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and a policy fellow at the University of Montreal's Centre for International Studies. He was senior advisor of science diplomacy at the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna from 2017 to 2018. He's recently completed visiting professorships at the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna and the Academy of Diplomacy and International Governance in the UK. Daryl specializes in the role of science and technology in diplomacy. And during his 30-odd years as a career diplomat in the Canadian Foreign Service, he served at postings in Thailand, Ethiopia, New Zealand, and Malaysia, as well as various positions in Ottawa and Toronto. Daryl is widely published in both the popular and the academic press, including what I would describe as his iconoclastic volume, Guerrilla Diplomacy, Rethinking International Relations with Lynn Reiner Publishers. And Daryl's presentation today is entitled The Essential Combination for a Planet in Peril, ? Science and Diplomacy. And he joins us, I believe, from McGregor Lake in Quebec. Welcome, Daryl. Wonderful to see you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Great to see you as well. And I want to thank you and David and Lee Hasden for putting this together. All much appreciated. It's been a long, hard, and rather isolating pandemic. And opportunities like this come along all too infrequently. I'd like to start with a brief synopsis of some recent reporting on developments which I think are of direct interest to the conference themes. I've got 5 of them. Here they go. Thousands of scientists warn of climate emergency, global tipping point near. Second, halt destruction of nature or risk a dead planet, say leading business people. 3, doomsday clock at 3 minutes to midnight, caution the atomic scientists. 4, defense budgets increased, development and diplomacy spending cut worldwide. 5, Afghanistan, or you could substitute Iraq or Libya, trillions of dollars and thousands of lives wasted through investment in state failure. Well, alarm bells are ringing, yet from everything I can see, most governments don't seem to be listening, or for that matter, acting. So to begin to understand how we've arrived collectively at this critical disjuncture, I think it's necessary to explore what lies behind and indeed beneath these headlines. Let me set out, therefore, something of a kind of a meta-analytical overview of my case, which will be followed by some more specific and detailed argumentation. I think that in the globalization era, and let me be clear, I'm convinced that this remains the defining historical characteristic of our times. The most profound challenges which imperil the planet, and I'm speaking here of climate change, environmental collapse, pandemic disease, public health, management of the global commons, diminishing biodiversity, species extinction, habitat destruction, resource scarcity, the search of energy sources. I could go on and on. They're all rooted in science, and they're all driven by technology. And this multiplicity of wicked issues together, I think, constitutes a fundamentally new threat set and really a sprawling array of challenges for which there are no military solutions. Some of you might be wondering about the term wicked issue. I don't know the level of familiarity with that, but I've got a nice little acronym. I think that a wicked issue is one that cuts. That's C-U-T-S, all capitalized, all ways. The C is for cross-cutting or cross-sectoral, the U is for unresolved, the T is for transnational, and the S is, of course, for science-based. These defining attributes render these sorts of issues notoriously difficult to manage, but they must be addressed. For these reasons and more, I think that science diplomacy represents the best and quite possibly the only hope for human survival. And I wonder if any of you are thinking that this is a rather ambitious claim. I hope that you are, and I hope that you'll call me on it. But I think not. Why? Underdevelopment and insecurity, far more than religious extremism, political violence, terrorism, these constitute the fundamental threats to world order. And in this context, the capability to generate, absorb, and use science and technology should play a critical role in addressing problems, resolving differences, reducing inequality, and otherwise improving security and development prospects globally. Although quality of life improvements and poverty reduction undoubtedly contribute to development, and development is a precondition to security, I think there's no question about that, scientific and technological capacity is largely alien to and almost invisible within most institutions of global governance, hence the term the global governance gap. Foreign ministries, development agencies, and indeed most multilateral organizations are just without the scientific expertise, the technological savvy, the cultural predisposition, the research and development network access required to manage S&T based issues effectively. In that regard, I think that science diplomacy, which is a transformative tool of soft power, which combines knowledge-based, technologically enabled problem solving with international political agency and connectivity, is an underutilized but indispensable resource. And in the face of the negative attributes of globalization, including economic and political polarization and the tendency to socialize costs while privatizing benefits, science diplomacy, I think, offers the prospect of engaging shared interests to overcome proximate constraints and enlarge international cooperation. Now, listen, notwithstanding the conventional wisdom and taking account of the present spike of armed conflict, the application of armed force just can't address the world's most pressing challenges. Security is not a martial art. Accordingly, I believe that sustaining broadly based development, bridging the digital divide, responding to the needs of the poor. These must become priorities for both diplomacy and international policy, but they're not least because of the serious misallocation of international policy resources, which privileges the coercive hard power associated with the military and intelligence agencies, among others. This trend towards the misallocation of international policy resources is continuing unabated. If this is to change, and the arrival at some sort of disastrous global tipping point is to be averted, diplomacy, informed by science and empowered by technology, will have to displace defense as the international policy of choice, policy instrument of choice, and all of the process and structural obstacles that implies will have to be overcome. Because lasting peace and prosperity will otherwise remain elusive. Remember, as I often tell my students, you can't garrison against pandemic disease. You can't call in an airstrike on a warming climate, on a warming globe. And you certainly can't send out an expeditionary force to occupy the alternatives to a carbon economy. So that's my best effort at setting out the big picture. And I can certainly provide extensive references for anyone who's interested in support of the points made. But what I'd like to do in the few minutes that remain, and let me say, it's difficult to try and condense a full semester course into 15 minutes, but I'm really just trying to hit the high points here. I'd like to unpack some of the key terms a bit, look back, and then have a look around at the current state of affairs and try and identify what might have to be done if performance is to be improved. First, the conceptual building blocks. What exactly is science? Well, I think that science is an empirical, evidence-based form of knowledge acquisition, featuring postulation, experimentation, verification, dissemination, and peer review. Diplomacy, which I spent 30 years doing, it's a nonviolent approach to the management of international relations, and it features dialogue, negotiation, compromise, representation, and problem solving. Science diplomacy. Well, it involves the use of scientific collaboration among and between nations and international organizations to advance knowledge, build constructive partnerships, and address the common problems facing humanity. The connection to politics and international relations, I want to emphasize, is key because science diplomacy is not to be confused with international scientific cooperation, which doesn't typically involve the direct participation of political actors or interests, is often commercially oriented, and is conducted mainly within the private sector. So science diplomacy and international science cooperation are very different things. So does science diplomacy sound good? Well, here's the rub. Science and diplomacy, unfortunately, represent two solitudes. And more on that coming up. In the meantime, I think that the case for elevating S&T matters to the top of the diplomatic and international policy priority list remains compelling. Evidence-based decision-making and public policy development are the hallmarks of good governance and responsible public administration. And as is often remarked, policy without science is gambling. Moreover, I think that certain aspects of scientific endeavor, not unlike the case of democracy or human rights, are of universal value and applicability. Scientific culture and the methods that it uses encourage openness, transparency, that's through the publication of findings. They encourage merit through peer review, and civic values through the publication of research findings and the setting out of critical and diverse perspectives, which is invaluable. Science offers a methodology and an approach that produces, I think, the closest thing that we get to proof and truth. And these attributes are desirable, and there simply aren't any alternatives. I think what I'll do, given the time constraints, is I'm going to skip over a couple of sections, but I'll be happy to share my thoughts on these with anyone that's interested. I wanted to look at why it is that science diplomacy is something which, if mentioned at a dinner party, will stop any conversation in its tracks. I think it has to do a lot with the image, reputation, and branding problems that both science and diplomacy have. Diplomacy is seen as something which is associated with weasel words, appeasement, caving into power, pinstripes and pearls, an endless cocktail circuit, and ineffectiveness generally. Science, dense, impenetrable, complicated, something many people wanted to drop in high school. They didn't want to memorize the periodic table. They didn't want to identify the parts of the cell, the endoplasmic reticula, and so on. So, you know, science and diplomacy, you combine the two and you get a bit of a double whammy, which is that they're very, very difficult concepts to communicate effectively, and both are in desperate need of a new narrative. So I've got 7 points on the obstacles to a science diplomacy renaissance. I'm going to skip over them, but instead, I'm just going to cut to the chase with a cautionary note. It's easy to become a cheerleader for science diplomacy. I've been one myself for over a decade. And many who've come late to the party come across as something akin to proselytizers or evangelicals. But science, it must be realized, it's a two-edged sword. It cuts all ways. Yes, it brings us vaccines, environmental treaties, arms control agreements, huge gains in agricultural productivity, and many other positive features. But it also produces weapons of mass destruction, addictive pharmaceuticals, and gene tampering. Diplomacy, for its part, has been very slow to modernize, and I've written reams on this. Its practices are antiquated. It relies more upon convention than innovation. And it's been slow to adapt to the revolution in science and technology. More importantly, it's been sidelined and marginalized as the legions march on and the lion's share of scarce international policy resources continue to flow into the military. And the question is, and this is a key public policy question, which no one seems to want to ask, if the key threats and challenges which face the planet have no military solution, then why is it that the lion's share of international policy resources continue to flow into defense departments rather than into foreign ministries and development agencies? Well, I think that's the fundamental public policy question which had to be put. Diplomacy, really, it's been sidelined and marginalized as the legions march on. So that's not great. Moreover, science diplomacy is not always on the side of the angels. Recall, for instance, the legacy of the secret cooperation between Pakistan, North Korea, Iran, and Libya on nuclear weapons development and nuclear propulsion technology. And A.Q. Khan, of course, a man revered in Pakistan and reviled in most other places, who was the quarterback for much of that proliferation, died last week. So all of which is to say, these are very complex issues which require careful scrutiny and delicate handling. So the wrap, well, let me leave you with 2 quotations. The first is from Albert Einstein, a refugee scientist, an anti-war activist, And a true believer in diplomacy, you'll remember that he and Bertrand Russell wrote the Manifesto to World Leaders, which resulted in the Pugwash movement, which is more or less morphed into something like Science for Peace. And I use him all the time, but the one I'm going to offer today is this. Learn from yesterday, live for today, and hope for tomorrow. The important thing is to not stop questioning. The second quotation I will leave you with is by my favorite British author, analyst, and journalist, the late Robert Fisk, who said, memorably, "The only thing we ever learn is that we never learn." I'm sorry that I've gone a couple of minutes over time, but not much. And thank you for that.
Daryl, thank you. Thank you so much for that. I did introduce you, in fact, as an iconoclast, and there is a line of research in diplomatic studies that looks at reflectivity, or the reflexive diplomat. And I think you are the personification of that. And I remember the very first time that I met you years and years ago, I had that impression. And I was very grateful that the Canadian Foreign Service, let's say, was engaged with you in these kinds of conversations over 3 decades. It is quite a stunning testament, I think, to both yourself and to the Canadian Foreign Ministry. Thanks, Daryl. Now, I wanted to move on to Lydia, and I wonder, Lydia, if you can come on screen at the moment as I introduce you. Lydia Stazen is the Executive Director of the Ruff Institute of Global Homelessness, IGH, which is a partnership between DePaul University and DePaul International London. Founded in 2014, the Institute of Global Homelessness is the first organization to focus on homelessness as a global phenomenon, with an emphasis on those who are living on the street or in emergency shelters. Lydia has held executive leadership roles in anti-poverty organizations across the Midwest, focusing on housing, employment, education, and policy advocacy. She is a former vice president of All Chicago Making Homelessness History, where she was instrumental in integrating homeless data with medical data to help patients experiencing homelessness to access housing services. Immediately prior to joining the Ruff Institute, Lydia served as Vice Chancellor of Advancement and President of the City Colleges of Chicago Foundation, where her key achievements included establishing a fund for student basic needs emergencies and securing funding for a full-time staff position to drive a college-wide response for students experiencing homelessness. Lydia joins us today from Chicago. Welcome, Lydia.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with all of you today. I think I'll very much be focusing on applied diplomacy as I explain a little bit more about what the Institute of Global Homelessness does and how it intersects with science diplomacy, with environmental knowledge, and with global public health. Someone earlier in their comments talked about a wicked problem, and I think homelessness certainly can be considered a wicked problem because of its complexity. I do have some brief slides to share, so we'll just wait a moment while I pull those up. So when we talk about an issue as large as global homelessness, IGH had to figure out pretty quickly how we were going to tackle such a large international issue. And we've come up with a tagline, see it, solve it, share it, to describe what it is that we do. In that first category of see it is really around our international advocacy, primarily through the United Nations, to focus on definition of homelessness. What is homelessness? And accompanying measurement along with those definitions. So how many people fit those types of definitions of homelessness? We cannot answer the question right now, how many people around the world are homeless? So that's the first primary aim of our work. The second aim of our work is where we partner with cities and countries at all levels of government and civil society who are ready to take some concrete action to address homelessness in their particular contexts. And then finally, our last theme of work is really around sharing what works, what doesn't work, so that we can spread that evidence base and apply that evidence base more widely around the world towards better outcomes for people experiencing homelessness. I have a bit of a snapshot of those communities where we have hand-in-hand partnerships around the world. So you can see we have a very diverse cohort of cities that we work with, representing all of the different continents, so that we have a really global view of what's happening around the world on the issue of homelessness. When we think about homelessness and how to sustainably address it, we think about the three different spheres of sustainability. So looking at the economic sphere and the commoditization and financialization of housing that has occurred in every single country around the world, the poverty and the low wages that keep people from engaging in sort of the fair market side of housing. What is their access to capital? As well as the social sphere and the social exclusion and the stigma, the oppression that happens when people are experiencing homelessness. And then finally, considering also the environmental sphere. What are the impacts of climate change? What are the impacts of poor quality housing? What are people's access to land? What are their rights to land? So those are some of the areas that we coach communities through and coach governments through as they consider what types of strategies they would like to use to address homelessness in their contexts. One of the first pieces of work that IGH did was to work with really renowned and well-known researchers, academic researchers who focus primarily on the issue of homelessness, to come up with a flexible framework that communities can use to define what homelessness looks like in their context. So I know we have a bit of an international audience today, so I'm curious if people are willing to put in the chat what homelessness looks like in your community. Do you see these types of homelessness existing on the streets of your community? Here in Chicago, we have every single one of these manifestations of homelessness except for 2D. Here in the city, we do not have internally displaced persons camps, but we do have almost every single other category of homelessness. So if we can just pop those in the chat, it would be really interesting for me to see from all of you the types of homelessness that you see there. But what we do know is that in every community in the world has that highest green level of homelessness. So people without accommodation, people living in temporary or crisis accommodation, and people living in severely inadequate and insecure housing. So what does applied science diplomacy look like at IGH? It looks a lot of different ways for us. Thinking about Daryl's comments earlier about how science is kind of a bad concept and we have to be defending it, or maybe it was Jeffrey who mentioned that. So we don't necessarily say that we are doing applied science diplomacy at IGH, but in fact, when you look at our activities, we certainly do. We are every day working with local and national governments. We're working with non-governmental organizations and civil society actors. We are working with academics and researchers and other stakeholders to bring an evidence base, a scientific evidence base to bear in their communities. We work with them to define what homelessness looks like within their disparate contexts, and then to enumerate homelessness using some acceptable scientific methodologies. There are lots of different methodologies for capturing data and enumerating the number of people who are experiencing homelessness, but not all of them meet what we would consider to be minimally accepted scientific standards. So really bringing some of these scientific methodologies and practices into conversations with different governments and stakeholders. And really the goal, as I have mentioned, is to spread that evidence base and to push for more positive outcomes for people experiencing homelessness. And this happens really through, largely through knowledge sharing and through the technical assistance that we're able to provide to these stakeholders. We also partnered with 2 other international universities to launch the International Journal on Homelessness, which is the first peer-reviewed academic journal, and actually currently only the only peer-reviewed academic journal that looks at the issue of homelessness through an international lens. So that first issue will be launching later this year. So we're particularly proud of that. So the next area to really talk through is sort of the environmental knowledge component and how that intersects with our work at IGH. So the United Nations has 17 different sustainable development goals that were all ratified by the member states in 2015. And goal number 13 is really about climate action. So you can see it there on your screen. Take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. And we can see a clear connection between climate change and its impact on housing and homelessness. So 22 million people every single year are displaced by climate events. We anticipate that that number is only going to increase in the coming years. A survey of homeless services providers in Australia reported that extreme weather, so the different fires that they're having that are directly tied to climate events, all that type of weather is a pathway to homelessness for 16% of their clients. So really beginning to see that connection between climate change and homelessness. We had, very sad examples of this recently here in our country as well, where the recent flooding in New York tied to Hurricane Ida caused 13 people to lose their lives. And those people were all living in basement apartments, which I think would all fall into that category, that third category of IGH's flexible framework for defining homelessness around inadequate or insecure accommodation. So you're going to see more and more of these events taking the lives of people, causing them to move, causing them to migrate. So lots of connections between issues of housing and homelessness. And so what does, applied environmental knowledge look like at IGH? For us, it's macro level as we make very clear the connections between inadequate housing and homelessness, climate migration and climate change, and the shocks that we're already seeing happen to the systems around housing and homelessness. For us, implied environmental knowledge is also micro level as we really share knowledge and advocate for high quality housing and improvements or upgrades to current housing stock. There's a huge evidence base around low quality housing having impact on people's respiratory health, on children's development when they are living in very low quality housing. So that's how we bring this particular intersection to bear with our work at IGH. And then finally, global public health and homelessness and the intersections there. It will not surprise any of you on the line today that homelessness is very bad for your health. It decreases life expectancy for people experiencing homelessness by approximately 1/3, consistently across all of the studies that have been done on these intersections. People experiencing homelessness have much higher rates of respiratory illnesses, higher rates of disease that are preventable by vaccines like hepatitis. In locations where they're relevant, they're also experiencing higher rates of malaria and other tropical diseases. Mental health disorders are both an increased risk factor for homelessness and also a result of homelessness. And so it's a very complicated intersection there around mental health and homelessness. The lack of housing brings with it lack of access to healthcare and to health services. And so we see frequent use of high cost forms of care, like emergency departments, those emergency pop-up clinics, those types of things. Most people experiencing homelessness have a really hard time taking medication regularly, and they may sometimes even sell the medication that they have in order to meet some of their other basic needs. So really difficult choices people are facing when it comes to their survival. We have, some real opportunity, I think, to talk about homelessness at an international level that has really come to the forefront because of the coronavirus pandemic. So in April 2020, so the very early days of the pandemic, Leilani Farha, who at the time was the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, put out a series of briefs for governments what they should do in terms of protecting people who are homeless during the pandemic. And within that guidance, a very powerful quote, housing has become the frontline defense against the coronavirus. Housing has rarely been more of a life or death situation. And in the face of this pandemic, a lack of access to adequate housing is a potential death sentence for people living in homelessness and puts the broader population at continued risk. Homelessness being a potential death sentence for people has always been true, but was even more so during the pandemic, and allowed us to talk about it, homelessness, in ways that people understood were very connected to the health of all of our communities. So again, what does sort of applied global health and homelessness look like for IGH? We mapped the positive actions that were taken by governments in response to the coronavirus. We saw eviction moratoriums. We saw a massive influx of funding. Many governments used the empty hotels because tourism had stopped and business travel had stopped to accommodate, at least temporarily, people who were experiencing homelessness in ways that would protect and preserve their lives. Across the board, we saw much greater collaboration between homeless services and services. And unfortunately, there also were some negative actions by governments. We saw a much greater push in some countries to criminalize people who were experiencing homelessness. So, rather than be on the street and be a perceived public health threat, they would just, do sweeps and incarcerate people who were experiencing homelessness. We do have some wonderful examples of what Building Back Better can look like. Our colleagues in Glasgow, Scotland have essentially eliminated street homelessness. They have maintained less than 10 people sleeping on the streets there since May of 2020. They've been able to maintain those very, very low numbers of people sleeping on the street, in part because they have had a really close collaboration as a result of the pandemic with their health services there. So just a quick snapshot for all of you around, what the application of these different themes can look like for an organization that is focused on a particular social issue. So as folks, have any questions about our work, about how these themes intersect with the work, happy to answer or converse on those themes. Thank you very much.
Lydia, thank you so very much. That was, let me assure you, much more than a snapshot. It was sobering, edifying, and very enlightening. So thank you so much for introducing us to your work and for explaining the connection from the local level to a problem that is global in its consequences. And that, I think, is really, something that we should all take away from us, and I certainly will, speaking personally. And just a quick reminder to everyone, please put any questions to our panelists, including Lydia, through the Q&A section down on the right side of your screen. So please add any question you might have there, indicating whether you want to ask all three panelists or just the one. So now I want to introduce Mark Potosnak. Mark, very nice to meet you and welcome. Mark is Professor and Chair of the Department of Environmental Science and Studies at DePaul University here in Chicago. His research focuses on interactions between the plants and air quality. Specifically, he studies how trace gas emissions from plants affect atmospheric chemistry and how climate change will impact this interaction in the future. He was a fellow in the Advanced Study Program at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and his field studies have been conducted in temperate, tropical, urban, arid, and tundra ecosystems. Not that there's too much left, but well done, Mark. He also deploys low-cost sensors that allow urban areas to be more resilient to climate change. He's the author and co-author of multiple publications, including, Mark, you'll have to explain later, Isoprene Emission Response to Drought and the Impact of Global Atmospheric Chemistry, published in 2018. And, I love this one, a high altitude balloon platform for determining exchange of carbon dioxide over agricultural landscapes. Mark joins us today from Chicago. Welcome, Mark.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction. I'd love to talk about isoprene all afternoon. It's the gas I grew up with, but today we'll talk a little bit about climate change. So let me just get the technology handled here. And I think if I do that, can someone give me a thumbs up if they're seeing the screen okay?
All good.
Okay, terrific. Well, it's a real pleasure going after both Daryl and Lydia. It was really two nice talks and can make some really good connections. I'm going to talk about climate change. So I think as I go through that will have a lot of connections to what Daryl talked about. But just to start talking with Lydia, talked about homelessness, and she drew these really important connections between homelessness and climate change. I want to even step back. At DePaul, we're starting a new initiative called Just DePaul. And of course, it's focused on justice, but the key is it's social and environmental justice. And the thesis is that these are not separate issues, that these are all intertwined. So Daryl talked about that wicked problem, and certainly climate change is a wicked problem. And we acknowledge that homelessness, likewise, there's just all these levels of complexity, but a lot of them really have the same roots. And so when we think about this, obviously, then it's a natural lead into diplomacy and the positive role that could play, because it's really, it's this, teasing apart and figuring out how to form solutions to really complex problems. Okay, so I said I wouldn't talk about isoprene, and I'm not going to talk much about isoprene, but I do want to give a little bit of it is my background. Everybody likes talking about their background, and I appreciate that introduction, but I also want to give a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm not a climate scientist. I have a considerable amount of training in climate science, but I'm not a producer of climate science. I think the best way to think about it is that my personal research, which is looking at interactions between plants and the atmosphere, is very highly informed by climate science. But you could read all through the climate reports that I'll be talking about, and you'll never see my name. I'm not an author. I'm not a producer of these either understanding the climate as it works today or making predictions into the future. That said, I have a bit of training in it. I did get the chance to go up to Alaska to do some field work. I think as was mentioned, the Arctic ecosystems were one on that long list. I don't travel quite as much as I used to. I try and do more research right here in the state of Illinois and right here in Chicago. But just you can look at the graphic there and kind of get a sense so I don't look at producing climate change predictions, but very much climate change informs my research. Okay, so thinking about science diplomacy, and unlike Daryl, I'm a scientist, I'm not a diplomat, but I have thought a lot about climate change communication and how scientists, and particularly climate scientists, do and should talk to others, whether they be diplomats or people we meet out in the street, or in my case, I think a lot about people I meet at church. I talk about the Catholic perspective on climate change. I'm sure many of us in the audience or on the panel and in the audience know all about what's called COP. This is the Conference of Parties. Been going on for a long time, so we're up to number 26, and this will be the next chance coming up in just the end of the month and into November for all nations to get together and think about or not just think, but decide what we need to do about climate change. And I guess I would think now these are not really questions for science diplomacy, but I would think people interested in science diplomacy might ask scientists two kind of essential questions. What is the impact of greenhouse gases today? And what will be the impact of greenhouse gases in the future? Now, if you want answers to that question, they're out there. But I'm going to focus kind of a little bit of a meta-analysis that I think will be interesting to this audience, and think about how scientists have answered these questions. And now honestly say that scientists probably haven't done the best job historically of answering questions like this in the policy and diplomatic arenas. They've tended to answer as they would to a fellow scientist, which just doesn't make a ton of sense from my perspective. So I think this fits in really well with what Daryl was talking about. I mean, he's saying that, and this is absolutely true, science now is going to play this very elevated role. Truth seeking might be a little bit not the right way to put it, but that's essentially, we're being asked to provide really important information about decisions that will affect the world economy and how we organize that economy. So I think scientists, then, it's incumbent upon us to really provide information, and not just that's technically right, but that's communicated well. So that's kind of what I'm going to go for. And I'm going to show you some stuff where I'm going to say, I think we historically haven't done the best job we could do. So I'm sure many of us are aware of the so-called IPCC assessment reports. That's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They've been at this for quite a long time. You can see over 30 years of scientists conveying climate change information, all the way back from when I was an undergraduate student in 1990 up until actually the current report, the 2021, is showing it to you, but it's a draft. It's not even complete yet. So we have over 30 years of climate change science. Here's the good news in communicating climate change, is that the essential message, it has not changed. We haven't figured anything new out about the kernel of the issue. And, we're all on board with this, but just in case, burning fossil fuels increases carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere. The greenhouse effect warms the Earth's surface. And then finally, the list of impacts: sea level rise, glaciers, ecosystem health deterioration, and then storms, droughts, and other types of extreme weather becoming more extreme and severe. So that's where we're at. But then, so let's talk about how scientists might answer, remember this first question here: what is the impact of greenhouse gases today? Well, all the way back in 2001, I'm sorry, I want to make one other point. I'm sure many of you are aware of this. But in 2007, this group of scientists was given the Nobel Prize in Peace, the Nobel Peace Prize. So I think really already 14 years ago, this was an acknowledgement that the science wasn't just speaking to other scientists, but which should and hopefully does speak more broadly. So look, the point of these graphs is not for us to dive into the science, but to think about how the science is being communicated. And what we should take away here is, 20 years ago, the scientists were trying to make a big point. And I guess, if you're a policy person, how do you dive into a graph like this and extract the information you need to extract? Well, you could say, oh my gosh, look at all the different things here. Now, maybe the what we like to call the x-axis, that what's along the bottom there, is kind of easy to understand. Level of scientific understanding going from high to very, very low. Somewhat frightening, all the very, very lows on this panel. So I would say this is a little overwhelming, but it had some nice attributes. You could pick out CO2. You might not know all the other names and acronyms there, but you could pick out CO2, and you could certainly see that it was positive and in the red. I think some not necessarily poor decisions. I don't want to make it sound like that, but in terms of communication, you look over at the y-axis, the up and down axis, and we're used to seeing things like dollars maybe, or growth rates on population. That's pretty easy. Something called radiative forcing. I don't know. Doesn't sound good. And I think we have enough science background to know that that's what's causing the problem, but it's a little bit of an obscure comment or concept. Now, there's another two series of ones, one from 2007, and I'll just skip ahead to its cousin here in 2014. Sorry, your cover, 2013, my apologies. And we'll look at how they've kind of evolved. And I was going to argue that they didn't evolve in the right direction. This one figure, I could spend a week in my undergraduate science class talking about all the little pieces. I mean, it's conveying uncertainty, it's giving us relative contributions, it's bringing in different processes, there's colors, there's numbers, there's acronyms. Oh my gosh, I mean, I think I understand most of what this is trying to convey. There's some interesting, subtle little things. I mean, there's all this crazy stuff, but is this how we really want to convey climate change science? If it takes someone who's fairly well versed in climate science, if it takes me hours to ponder this graph and figure out all the little wiggles and what's important. Also, you can see they went horizontal. I have no idea why. but instead of up being bad and hot and down being cool and good, they using left and right, which is, not crazy, but why do it? So let's go to today, the report that was just released in about the last month or so, and you can see they drastically simplified it. They took this really there's this story that they were trying to cram everything into one figure, and they've toned it down, trimmed it down, and then look, they brought back the colors. Up is hot, down is no. You can see there's almost no acronyms left on this figure. It's all words that we can read, most of which make a lot of sense. A couple like volatile organic compounds and carbon monoxide, that's a little bit like, oh, I don't know what he's talking about there. Isoprene is a volatile organic compound, so I know a bit about it, but it's so much. I think this has the punch that's necessary. In particular, it tells you stories like the carbon dioxide is most of the problem. Methane is also, though, a big player. So this really conveys things well. And really importantly, look at the the vertical axis now, up and down. Degrees Celsius. Yes, I understand we're here in the United States. Maybe we should translate this into Fahrenheit for our American audience, but I think most of us know that a degree Celsius is about 2-ish Fahrenheit. So they've made it back into something understandable, and in some respects wrapped around to where they started. So also, I won't go through this. I have a whole series of slides that I didn't include, but as they went through these 30 years of report, they also talked about how confident they were that human activities, that human influence was causing climate change. And finally, in this last report, they didn't mince words anymore. And you can imagine, I won't go through the words that were minced, but they said that it's unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. 100%. But it took us 30 years to make that unequivocal statement. I just want to then talk very briefly about that second question, how scientists are asked to, well, how about the future? And the really key point I want to make here that I think is obviously very relevant to diplomacy is, imagine you're a climate scientist and you're asked to talk to Congress about your what it's going to be like in 2100 or even 2050. Well, the key is the climate in the future and climate impacts in the future. You have to start with, I call it CO2 emissions, but let's be a little bit more broad and talk about all greenhouse gas emissions. You have to start there. That's not a natural science question. That's a social science question. You need economists, you need policymakers, you need demographers, you need all these other things. So it's tough. It's tough. The scientists actually have to start. I think I'll skip this and just go to the chase on this this picture here. But and the climate scientists and social scientists started working with each other. They thought they kind of step along 1, 2, 3, 4, and they said, okay, social scientists, come up with some predictions for the future. And they did. And what they did is they came up with what are called scenarios. It wasn't sufficient because we don't know what policy will be like. We don't know how diplomacy will come into play. So they came up with so-called scenarios to predict emissions of what might happen. And so fine, they could step on from there. The problem is it takes a tremendous long time, and that knowledge keeps changing. So you can imagine the poor policy people would try and incorporate the latest information. They'd hand it to the climate scientists. The climate scientists would then do their job. And by the time the climate scientists had finished, they'd go back to the social scientists. And they said, well, everything's changed now. Our predictions need to be modified because it's set 5 years later. So they've actually gone to a more kind of roundabout approach. I won't go through all the details. You'll see this in the policy and diplomatic literature. These representative concentration pathways kind of solve this by simplifying the idea. And I think that's, again, goes back to my theme. You sometimes need to simplify a little bit. But in conclusion, I could say a couple things here. Over the course of 30 years, scientists did, I think, eventually learn to really how to communicate more effectively with policymakers and diplomats. I think that's in trouble from the get-go, but I think that came around quite nicely. I do think now when we're at this new point where there is broad agreement between nations that action must be taken to drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that then kind of changes it a little bit, because I think these details that we've kind of learned that we can't give this incredibly complex picture. Now we do. We need to know these little details. I'm not going to go through all these bullet points, but you can see now it's this tension between providing a story that people can wrap their heads around in terms of climate change, but then, that very specific policies that are going to need to be implemented internationally need to be done here. So I'll leave it there. I'll stop the share, and thanks very much.
Mark, thanks very much. That, as your two co-panelists, that was a superb presentation. And, for someone like me, doesn't know very much about the empirical aspects of the topic you're talking about, this was incredibly enlightening. So thank you very, very much for that. And I just want to remind everyone that you can ask our panelists a question, and you just go to the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and you can type it in there. Now, I have one question from Philip Stalley, and this is addressed to all the panelists, and it is, to what extent do you consider yourself a diplomat, environmental or otherwise? In what ways can your work be considered diplomacy or related to diplomacy? Now, it's possible that this one is slightly teed up for Daryl. So I think, Daryl, I might just ask the panelists to respond to that question in the order of the panel presentations. So Daryl first, Lydia, and then Mark. Daryl, would you like to tackle that one?
Listen, I represented Canada at home and abroad for 30 years. And when you are in government and working for the state and engaging in advocacy and representation and the pursuit of interests, well, you're doing diplomacy. I tried to define diplomacy. What I didn't mention was that I think that the word loses its meaning if it becomes disconnected from representation on the part of governments and international organizations. So I do think that the connection to political actors and interests is fundamental to the practice of diplomacy. I left the foreign ministry in 2011. And since then, I have not been doing diplomacy. I've been doing advocacy. I've been trying to, to the extent that I possibly can, make the case as persuasively as possible that diplomacy really represents the best way forward, because it's a non-violent and highly cost-effective approach to trying to manage international relations. But I certainly no longer consider myself a diplomat. Instead, I'm an analyst. And so diplomacy is done by the representatives of states and international organizations. It's on the record. It's there for review by, really anyone that's interested. But criticism and analysis, I think, is really within the purview of those who are outside of government, because when you're in government, there are a number of constraints. I mean, these range from the Official Secrets Act to the Vienna Conventions, and I found this very difficult through my entire 30-year passage in diplomacy. You're not giving your own views; you're giving the perspectives of the country, or if you work for the UN or the World Bank or whomever. those who pay your salary, and look after your welfare. I must say, I have found it in the 10 years since I've been out of diplomacy immensely liberating, because I'm no longer required to toe any line or speak in accord with government policy. But diplomacy and diplomats, this is stuff which is on the record, which is practiced by the representatives of states and international organizations. And I frequently read that diplomacy is something that's practiced by business people and NGO representatives and journalists. Well, I have to say that if that's your definition of diplomacy, then I don't subscribe to it. Because if diplomacy loses its connection to policy and decision-making in government and international organizations, then it becomes a rather meaningless term.
Lydia, I am going to turn to you. If you could unmute and return to video, that would be fantastic. And are you hearing me, Lydia?
I can hear you, yes. I think I need Raina to turn my video on for me. There we go.
Okay, thank you.
Great, here I am.
So can I make your task slightly more complicated? Daryl has given a wonderful response. And the question that was asked was, to what extent do you consider yourself a diplomat, environmental or otherwise? And in what ways can your work be considered diplomacy? And I'm going to throw in the third. Do you ever find yourself thinking what you understand to be diplomatically in what you do about homelessness?
I think the best way that this connects with the work of IGH is our advocacy at the United Nations. So we are directly interacting with diplomats from other nations and working with them to try to influence their government's policy, the international policy resolutions and documents that are issued by the UN, et cetera. We are pushing for very specific language, very specific policies. And so to that extent, I think the work that IGH does is a form of applied diplomacy. And then, all of those sort of soft skills that you need as a diplomat, I think come into play at the local level work that we do, working with mayoral administrations, those types of things, and applying some of those diplomatic skills to the work that we do.
Good. Lydia, thank you so much. And Mark, what about you? It was a two-part question. You can address the third again if you like, but what's your response to the question?
Well, certainly I don't consider myself a diplomat, but I would make this analogy. I would say that I've trained myself later in my career to become a communicator, a better communicator. And, I walked into a job as a professor. I knew a lot about a little, right? I had a very narrow understanding of a piece of science, and I had to teach myself how to teach. Right. And so, but I've also on my kind of, I don't know, advocacy is the right word, but my climate communication side of how to teach myself how to communicate. And I'm not pretending to be an expert or enormously effective at it. But I think that, yes, diplomatic has a narrow sense, but I think we are called as scientists to be better communicators and think about that we're not talking to our fellow scientists all the time, that we need to make our work more accessible and just convey it in language that we're honestly uncomfortable with.
Well, thank you so much, Mark, Lydia, and Daryl. That was a terrific question. And I think Philip has just thanked you himself for responding to his very probing and tricky question. Now, I have another question here from, again, one of our master students, and it's long, and that indicates the complexity of thought of our students. And let me read it to you. Despite continued warnings from climate scientists, governmental responses to climate change have been slow and inadequate. And I think you've all more or less spoken to that one way or another. The response from markets has been even less significant. In your estimation, is it time for a reframing of climate science that centers the economic impacts of climate change? It is clear that warnings of environmental changes presented not through the lens of economics are not enough to motivate governments and change market behavior. Now, I will borrow from David's technique from before, and perhaps, Mark, I wondered if you were able to pick up enough of that multi-part question and address it, and then Lydia, we'll keep you in the middle there, and then to Daryl at the end. I can repeat the question if needed, but Mark, were you able to pick up something that you'd like to speak to?
Sure. And I, so to start off with, for scientists, we think a lot about numbers. So when we start to get into policy and diplomacy, economics is like, well, they're our friends. Look, they use equations, they have numbers. It's a match made in heaven, right? So in some ways, I think that's a very tempting thing to say. Well, let's use market economics or let's use ecological economics or these different theoretical and mathematical treatments to discuss climate change. I mean, I can talk all day. Even though I'm not an economist, I love externalities. I can go on and on about that. But again, I think I would argue that while that's great, it's not the solution. The solution is communication. And I think, telling stories and telling stories about economic impact that people are facing, real stories, real people, that may be more effective in driving political change than me sitting there and trying to tease out the impact of climate change on GDP in 2040 versus 2060 versus 2080. Like, I'd love to do that. That sounds really fascinating. And I'd love to get into the math and the assumptions and the models, but really, talking about people that are impacted today, how not just in economics, but in like what Lydia looks like in housing, in homelessness. Those, I think, are in some ways a more compelling story than the economics itself.
Yes, I was in thinking through this question, thinking also about those three different spheres around sustainable development. What is sustainable development? And thinking through the economic sphere, the social sphere, the environmental sphere. And so I think the best messaging, the best cases for why we need change are going to touch on each of those spheres. So a long way of saying, yes, I think the economic argument should be there, but it should not be the only argument.
Very good, thank you. And Daryl, do you have a take on this question?
I thought that was a great question, but I think it actually begs a larger question. I mean, we can ask ourselves, are there differing perspectives on what is undoubtedly the number one threat and challenge facing us during our curatorial time here on the planet? And at the moment, it's climate change. And, I don't think it's a matter really of communicating the economics. I think it's a matter of understanding how we can fix the plumbing, because the plumbing is broken. The plumbing doesn't work. And this is why our performance, I mean, in dealing with the present pandemic or anything else that, any other examples that, you might care to adduce, performance has been patchy, if not poor. And I think the question is why. And my answer is that science and diplomacy remain in large part two solitudes. There's a great wall or a great divide that separate the two. And maybe I could just expand on this a bit. Two solitudes, floating worlds, they rarely intersect. How many diplomats are scientists? How many scientists are diplomats? How often do scientists and diplomats meet? When they meet, can they speak to each other? Do they speak the same language? I think these are enormous challenges, but they are dwarfed really by the structural differences that separates science and diplomacy. I mean, diplomacy is about stability and balancing power. Science is about change as opposed to stability and unleashing power. Diplomacy is about convention and the conventional, and diplomacy is terribly conventional in the Vienna Conventions. Science is about experimentation and discovery. That's very different. That's hugely different. Diplomacy is about averting risk. Science is about tolerating and managing risk. Diplomacy is about practice and, what's practical, like what's going to work. Science is about theory and the theoretical and postulating and hypothesizing. Diplomacy is about argument. Like we use tact, we use discretion, we use persuasion, influence, representation. Science, looking at facts, data, the results of our experiments. Diplomacy, negotiation and compromise. Science, trial and error. Diplomacy, political or policy development. Science, empirical knowledge. And how do we expand and elaborate it? How do we postulate the principles? Diplomacy happens in the polis. That's the world outside of our screens that we're all maybe looking at right now. Scientists do their work in the laboratory. So I think it's little wonder that scientists and diplomats feel alienated from each other. Scientists excel at, defining problems, performing objective assessments, but they worry about becoming politicized. And they're much less adept at proposing workable solutions. Diplomats, well, they're able to craft compromises and maybe even resolve differences. But they're subjectively inclined. Their work is informed by state or international organization interests, and they're unschooled in science. So they've often got trouble understanding the scientific terms, the methods, and the rationale. So the Great Wall, the Great Divide, how do we bridge it? It's an open question, and it's one that we've got to get to very soon.
Daryl, thank you so much for that. In fact, what was going through my mind as you spoke there is that, in fact, your 2016 Sage Handbook on Diplomacy chapter on science diplomacy is one of the best defenses and criticisms of science diplomacy at the same time. And I think that your answer just now has done exactly that. And with your permission, I would be more than happy to share that handbook chapter, and with the approval of the handbook editor, who is online with us today, we could send that out to all of the participants in that session. I think they really would enjoy it and see the background to the arguments that you've just made. Now, let me just thank three wonderful panelists for a superb session. I've thoroughly enjoyed it and learned a great deal. So thanks to you, Daryl, thanks to you, Lydia, and thanks, Mark. And we really hope we can continue engaging with you one way or the other. And so my final point is really just to thank everyone who came along today for joining us on this first day of a 3-day conference. Tomorrow, we will begin at 9 a.m. Chicago time with a keynote address by a former Foreign Service Officer, US Foreign Service Officer Robert Dry. He will be talking on the future of state-sponsored environmental diplomacy. Now, Robert's address will then be followed by 3 panels. The first will be entitled State-Sponsored Environmental Diplomacy Beyond the Paris Accord. The second one is on urban diplomacy and its contribution to building social, economic, and environmental sustainability. And the third one is titled Diplomacy and the Arts in the Age of the Anthropocene. So we thank you so much for your presence today, for your contribution, and to our panelists, thanks again, and we look forward to welcoming you back tomorrow. David, I will hand over to you in case you have anything you need to add at this point.
Well, I think you've summarized things very well, and I just want to reflect Jeff's thanks to all three of our wonderful panelists. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation, and I really hope that you will all be able to join us tomorrow and on Friday for the subsequent session. Our conversation continues. So thank you to everybody for your contribution to making this day such a wonderful conversation. Thank you, and good afternoon, good evening to everybody around the world.
Thanks, everyone.